I want to tell you why the most interesting book I read in 2018 was a book that was written more than 300 years ago. Have you ever eaten an avocado? Have you eaten cashews or plantains? You're aware of what barbecue is, right? If your answer to any of those questions was yes, you have this 17th century, late 17th century pirate to thank, William Dampier, for introducing those things to the English-speaking world. This pirate circumnavigated the globe 3 times in the 1680s, and one of the peculiarities of this man's contradictory existence was that he was a pirate who hated pirates. He could not stand the debauchery associated with the behavior of the pirates, which, being a pirate in the late 17th century was not a trip through Pirates of the Caribbean and Disney World. Disney World's ride and the Johnny Depp movies are a G-rated version of the horror movie that was the lives of pirates and pirate culture in the late 17th century and earlier than that. So he cannot stand the debauchery of these pirates, and even writes about it in this book, New Voyage Around the World. He's out in the Philippines at one point in 1687, and he writes dismissively of these pirates who he says grew drunk and quarrelsome on the ship. They at this point are very frustrated with a captain by the name of Captain Swan, and he says, their disorderly actions deterred me from going aboard. I did ever abhor drunkenness, which now our men aboard abandoned themselves wholly to, yet travel among them nonetheless he did. And he did that because this man's curiosity about the world was insatiable, and his addiction to documenting meticulously, obsessively, absolutely everything he saw around the world was boundless. As he's sailing around the world 3 times, he keeps especially the first time, he keeps this hollow bamboo tube into which he stuffs this scroll, this manuscript where he's jotting all of these meticulous notes about the things he sees and experiences around the world. It's sealed in wax. He shuts it every time he puts the scroll back in, and this is how he's preserving, without being damaged, his notes of his travels around the world. So those notes contribute to this smash hit called New Voyage Around the World. Comes out in 1697. And it launches a surge in travel writing at the time. Its influence is monumental at the time. He takes the world by storm through introducing it to animals, insects, wildlife, cultures, customs, peoples, nations, faraway lands that hardly anyone else on the face of the earth, unless they were a pirate or maybe a naval, I don't know, and a military officer or something, could even dream of seeing themselves. I can't even begin to scratch the surface in a single video of the magnitude of this man's influence, and sadly he is largely overlooked today for reasons that I'll explain. But he leads the first English-speaking expedition to Australia. It was not Captain James Cook who, quote, discovered Australia, as we're told on April 19, 1770. In fact, it was William Dampier leading the first English-speaking expedition to Australia in January of 1688, more than 80 years before Captain Cook ever got to Australia. As I mentioned, he not only introduces things like the avocado and the cashew and the plantain and barbecue to the English language, but his biographers, Diane and Michael Preston, found more than 1,000 entries in the Oxford English Dictionary that are attributable to William Dampier's writings, the things that he was noting and observing and discovering around the world. More than 1,000 words in the OED attributable to this pirate, William Dampier. This book, A Pirate of Exquisite Mind, is a full biography of this man. It's fascinating. I also recommend it along with first read Dampier's fascinating book and then get into his biography. But he is the first English-speaking person to write about Southeast Asia. So he introduces the English-speaking world to soy sauce. He introduces the English-speaking world to things like chopsticks, utensils that weren't known to the rest of the English-speaking world at the time. The breadfruit. he discovers this traveling throughout the Pacific. Now, what is the significance of that? His discovery of the breadfruit, once word of it spreads to the English-speaking world, is the reason that Captain William Bligh embarks on his ill-fated trip to go get breadfruit and transport it to the Caribbean. That, of course, becomes the story of Mutiny on the Bounty. It's because of William Dampier that Mutiny on the Bounty happens and becomes the film and the famous narrative that we know today. Then you have Gulliver's Travels. In the beginning of Gulliver's Travels, you have Lemur Gulliver saying that this fictitious character saying that it was on his advice that quote cousin Dampier, as he's referred to in Gulliver's Travels, wrote his Voyage Around the World. Samuel Taylor Coleridge is the person who calls him a pirate of exquisite mind, from which this title is taken, the title of his biography. So Rime of the Ancient Mariner owes no small debt to William Dampier's writings of his travels on the high seas. Then you have William Dampier writing about the marooned man, Alexander Selkirk, marooned on an uninhabited island in the Juan Fernandez Islands, 400 miles off the coast of Chile. Well, what story does that inspire? Robinson Crusoe. William Defoe comes up with that in 1719. So Robinson Crusoe comes to us thanks to this pirate William Dampier and his writings about the marooned sailor Alexander Selkirk. Also in Gulliver's Travels, you have Gulliver's descriptions of the Yahoos, right? Well, that's inspired by William Dampier's writings about these screaming spider monkeys in Terminos Lagoon on the Bay of Campeche, where at the time William Dampier is working with these log cutters, and these screaming spider monkeys come upon him in their midst and are flinging their feces at him, urinating at him, chasing him out of wherever he had stumbled upon them. That vivid descriptive writing also inspires the description of the Yahoos in Gulliver's Travels. And I'm just getting started about the immensity of this pirate's influence and the irony of how forgotten he is today. As a map maker, this man's the precision and the detail of his maps, based solely on just the observations that he makes with his two eyes, the contours of the coast of Australia, for instance, are the reason that people like Captain Cook, or 100 years later Horatio Nelson, are able to, they're still using his maps 100 years later, Dampier's maps, to navigate the globe. That's how detailed and precise those maps were. Here's the other thing that's mind-boggling is William Dampier ends up in the Galapagos Islands. Again, this is in the 1680s. Now, 1680s. Origin of Species, Charles Darwin's book, doesn't come out until 1859. This pirate is anticipating Darwin by more than 150 years through his descriptions of the turtles, which he describes as extraordinarily large and fat in the Galapagos Islands, and he has the idea because, thanks to his informed perspective through his travels around the world, is able to compare the size of the turtles in the Galapagos Islands to the size of the turtles that he has witnessed in the Cape Verde Islands or in the Caribbean, which are smaller and more modestly proportioned. And so what does he do? Again, anticipating Darwin by, 170 years? He realizes, at least notes the observation for what it's worth, beyond the comprehension of almost anyone in the world in his time, that geographic location may be responsible for variations in a species from one part of the world to another. It's William Dampier who introduces the English-speaking world to the word and the concept of subspecies. A pirate is responsible for all of this. And Darwin surely read Dampier. He said so. So Dampier, his writings on the Galapagos are part of the reason why Charles Darwin saw it as this wondrous place that he had to explore for himself, and ultimately we get his theories in The Origin of Species because of that. And I'm still not done describing the widespread nature of this pirate's influence. You'll find the liveliest descriptions of a countless array of insects and animals and sea life. Here's just a list that I put together of the descriptions of the kinds of animals that you'll see in his work, which I hope you'll read for yourself because it's just fascinating. Iguanas, turtle doves, armadillos, raccoons, hogs, goats, manatees, seals, sea lions, the beautiful blue-footed booby birds. Google that. Take a look at how mesmerizingly beautiful they are. Flamingos, ducks, scorpions, centipedes, barnacles, catfish, grouper, clams, mussels, crustaceans. These are marvels of descriptive zoology at a time when there was no such thing. William Dampier is inventing the genre, inventing that means and field of study aboard ships full of marauding pirates circumnavigating the globe from one point to another. And he's grounding all of these descriptions in this kind of ruthlessly rational style, utterly void of the hyperbole and the superstitions that tended to be attached to this kind of writing in his day. Now, in the Galapagos, you'll find these beautiful descriptions of turtles laying eggs on the beach, and he's meticulously, in rich detail, describing the process through which a turtle lays eggs on the beach. He describes the man-of-war birds in the Southwest Caribbean swooping down, big as kites, as he describes them, to snatch their prey out of the surface of the sea. He describes seals having the heads of lions in the Juan Fernandez Islands. He describes the flamingos in the Cape Verde Islands. Are you getting a sense of the breadth of this man's travels? I mean, we're going from the Pacific to off the coast of Chile to the Caribbean to the Cape Verde Islands. He also was in Virginia at one point and did not have a very pleasant time in Virginia, and as he was known to do, left out the unseemly details of his experience there. I think he was jailed for a while. He was only there for maybe 13 months or so. But this is the scale of the travel that he underwent, and he describes the flamingos beautifully in the Cape Verde Islands as being, when they're gaggled together, and because of their color, he describes them as looking like a brick wall from afar when they're all gathered together, because they are the color of new red brick, as he describes them. So these are again, it's marvelous to read because of the rich, glittering detail of his descriptions, but also when you realize that it's through the lens of that description that the entire English-speaking world is even becoming aware of these things. It's William Dampier, this pirate, who makes them aware of these creatures. Now, I still haven't scratched the surface, because Dampier, it turns out, perhaps without really knowing it, basically was a meteorologist too, because he encounters these typhoons in the Pacific, and really without comprehending the impact, the significance of what he's writing, he describes his experience tangling with a typhoon in the Pacific. And he describes the direction in which the wind is flowing as this typhoon approaches his ship. At first, the winds are blowing to the northeast, now because it's spinning counterclockwise, and then he's caught in the right fringe of the storm, northeast blowing winds, as it basically makes landfall over his ship. He describes how mysterious it was that the winds had gone calm, flat calm. Well, he's describing the eye of a hurricane at a time when the physics of a tropical cyclone in the northern hemisphere were virtually unknown to the world. And then he describes how the winds shift dramatically on the backside of the storm to the southwest. It would be more than 100 years before a British naval officer named Captain James Capper would start describing hurricanes as, quote, whirlwinds in his a book he wrote about his travels on the seas. 100 years later, James Capper comes along to make meaning of the observations that William Dampier made in the 1680s. And then in 1821, you have William C. Redfield, a meteorologist in Connecticut, who, after an unbelievable Category 2 hurricane makes landfall directly on Manhattan Island, directly on New York City. Imagine that happening today. It's a ferocious storm that causes the Hudson River and the East River to converge over Canal Street in New York City. They get at least 100-mile-an-hour winds in New York City. Again, can you imagine that happening today with all the development and the infrastructure and the density of the population there today? So Redfield is totally unaware of, Redfield's totally unaware of William Dampier, and to his credit, discovers independently of his knowledge of Dampier, or for that matter, James Capper, traveling from central Connecticut up to western Massachusetts to inform his wife's family of her recent death, and in the meantime notices a pattern in the damage of the prostrated trees that the storm had left behind. And it's, as he's starting out in central Connecticut, they're flattened toward the northeast, but then as he gets closer to Massachusetts, he notices that actually they're flattened to the southwest. Well, why is that? And he puts these clues together and starts talking to people about the direction that the winds were blowing at the same time as they were blowing from one direction in central Connecticut. They were blowing in precisely the opposite direction, closer to western Massachusetts. And he has this aha moment and realizes this means the storm was spinning counterclockwise. Well, guess what? A pirate had discovered that 140 years before you, Mr. Redfield. Redfield wasn't aware of that, but William Dampier really was the first person to realize and to jot down on paper, beyond the comprehension of the world in his moment in time, again, that storm swirled counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. This is genius. How did he know? It's just mind-boggling. All of the man's brain was beyond the comprehension of today's world, no less his own. But here's the reason why, despite the majesty of his writing, the scientific and cultural significance of these observations that he makes, he is sadly forgotten today. At least there is that biography by the Prestons, and at least there is his journals that we can go to today. But I would say a sad few people are doing so, and I hope that more people do, because it's worth a read, for at the very least. He's a pirate, and that very drunkenness and debauchery and behavior that he abhorred is the reason he was right to abhor that stuff, because it's the reason that he ends up being forgotten. By the time of William Redfield's day in the 1820s, Dampier's reputation basically had been shoved off the cliff of the English-speaking world's disgust with pirate culture. And William Dampier conveniently leaves those dirty details out of his pirate narratives. He doesn't talk about the fact that when he's in the Cape Verde Islands pondering flamingos, his crew members are at the very same time plotting the seizure of a nearby sturdier vessel that they want to seize to take to the Caribbean. He doesn't mention that in his books. He doesn't mention the fact that he's traveling the high seas at times with figures like Bartholomew Sharp, John Coxon, who previously had been had served under one of the most execrable human beings ever to sail the high seas, in Henry Morgan, who hung Spaniards by their testicles in order to get them to confess where their gold was when he ransacked in 1668 Portobello. And then in 1680 they ransacked Portobello again, and William Dampier was there for that one, and he doesn't mention in any specific detail whatsoever in his writing about those experiences the disgusting things that his fellow pirates are doing, raping women at knife point, torturing human beings on the rack, threatening to burn the whole town to the ground if the exorbitant sum that they're asking for in ransom in exchange for the hostages that they take, in some cases children, is not paid. He doesn't mention these things, but the world did wake up to the true nature of pirate culture, and unfortunately associated William Dampier with that kind of culture and saw him as no more than a low pirate unworthy of further consideration. And that is really to humanity's detriment, because as I hope I've made clear in this video, this was a genius. This was a man whose observations of the world that he saw while circumnavigating the globe 3 times were charged with the electrifying brilliance of this man's unbelievable brain. So again, it's you can find Memoirs of a Buccaneer. This is the Dover edition, so Dover editions are pretty cheap. This is an edition of the New Voyage Round the World from 1697, and if you fall in love with him, as I think you will if you read that book, you can get this A Pirate of Exquisite Mind by Diane and Michael Preston. They have a nice almost hour-long YouTube lecture about William Dampier that perhaps might be a good primer, and then get into the memoir and then the biography. It'll blow your mind. This was an amazing a man who you didn't realize perhaps was responsible for some of the greatest works of literature that the Western world knows. Gulliver's things in Gulliver's Travels, or Robinson Crusoe, or Mutiny on the Bounty. pretty amazing stuff. So check out William Dampier, the pirate. Look him up. Absolutely fascinating guy. I didn't expect going into last year that the most fascinating book I would read was one that was more than 300 years old, but that's how it turned out, because nothing I read last year, approximated the fascination that book instilled in me. I mean, it was just an amazing read. So check it out. This was one pirate worth knowing much more about. I hope you look into him and are as fascinated with his story as I am.